Hello and thanks for clicking in. This is the one and only Foreign Orchid, and please follow me on Twitter. As you can tell from the title of the video, today we're going to be looking at the demographics of the most recent presidential election and what they say about who really won the election and more accurately who lost the election. As you can see on screen right now, I went through the CNN and Wikipedia pages to get the demographics breakdown, and I did this for 4 continuous cycles from 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016, along with the key demographic breakdowns for all of those. 2004 does have a little bit of a strange thing. I couldn't find the age demographics as they break down for 2008, 12, and 16. One of the most common things that came out of the presidential election night coverage immediately before the exit polls were known was this idea that men put President-elect Donald Trump in office. As you can see right here, however, the rate of male participation in the election hasn't really changed that much over the last 4 cycles. It did increase ever so slightly, but I don't think that's a driving force for the kind of shift we've seen for the Republican Party this election. So I think that idea is a little bit baseless. But following from it, what ended up coming up was the idea that white men were the real force for Donald Trump. And as you can see here, the voter turnout, or sorry, the percentage of the voters that are actually white men has actually decreased this year as opposed to 8 and 12 years ago. And their voting rates for Republican Party haven't really shifted in the last 16 years. Then the next part that came up was this idea that white women were the reason why Donald Trump won the election, because they shifted their vote for Donald Trump as opposed to Secretary Hillary Clinton. But again, we can see right here that the rate of white women joining the election has been on a slow trend downward since 2004, and that it wasn't a unique situation for this election. And even then, the trend has only been a 1% reduction from 4 years ago. Next up, the actual rate of women voting for the Democratic Party hasn't changed. So this idea that this election cycle was unique in having women not voting for the Democratic candidate is actually a poor argument to make. What we do see is that they actually declined in voting for Donald Trump, and that decline was met by a equal rise in the number of people voting for third party. So I think the argument that white women as a voting bloc shifted or caused the election to go in the favor of Donald Trump misunderstands what actually happened here. Of course, then there's the argument that it was white people in general, but as you can see right here, white people as a percentage of the voting populace has actually decreased quite a bit in the last 12 years, with 2004 having the highest rate of white participation at 77%, and since then gone down to just 70% this year. And the rate of Democrats pulling the white vote has decreased a little bit, but we haven't actually seen an increase in the number of people voting for the Republican Party. What we do see is an increase in third-party participation. Indeed, you see that increase in third-party participation throughout this entire chart, especially when you get down to the age brackets. But the white demographic hasn't shifted its voting for President-elect Trump. It has just declined slightly, and I do stress slightly, in its support for the Democratic Party in this last election cycle. One thing that was interesting, though, is if you look at the racial demographics, is that support for Secretary Clinton among the African American community has actually gone down quite quite a bit. I was surprised by that, and even increased for the Republican Party. They've actually shown the least increase for third-party picks. That, to me, was a very surprising revelation that this voting bloc chose to switch to the Republican Party rather than to the third party, as almost every other group has. Moving on from there, you can look at the age breakdowns. This is another one of the stories that came out, was that millennials especially just didn't show up at the polls, and that because they didn't show up at the polls, they caused the Democratic Party to lose. But we can clearly see that the demographics for millennial vote participation is the same for the last 12 years, or for the last 3 cycles, so that the people in the youngest group, 18 to 24, have had essentially the same participation rate. Same thing for 25 to 29 and 30 to 39. But the biggest shift here was that the Republicans managed to maintain, in large part, their share of that youth group, but the Democratic Party was losing it quite a bit. Indeed, the biggest voting bloc for third parties were among those under 40. The next big idea that came out was that the rural vote, in particular the rural white vote, but it was really hard to find data that breaks down rural and white as a single group. But looking at just the rural, urban, and suburban breakdowns, we can see that since 2008, and even since 2012 for that matter, there has been a downward shift in the number of rural voters as a voting bloc, and an increase in the number of urban voters, while suburban voters have been largely left unchanged. What we do see, however, that is really important is that while there's been a slight shift upwards among rural voters towards voting Republican, the downward shift for people voting Democrat has been the strongest over all 3 categories of urban, suburban, and rural, and that shift downwards for the Democratic vote was what pushed up the third-party candidates in this election. So once again, looking at the whole graph, we can see that in general, the Republican Party over the last several election cycles hasn't really gained any support among the voting population. Rather, it's done a fairly decent job at maintaining their rate of vote participation. So what this tells me, and I think what is really important for the Democratic Party to take from this, is the notion that the Republican Party has managed to gain votes or managed to draw out additional supporters is largely untrue, nor is it true that the negativity of the campaign has depressed the vote so much on both sides, because the participation rate for both sides is largely unchanged, and that's why we still see the same rate of same rate of young people in this election cycle as we did the last 2 election cycles, where we were lauding young people for coming out and voting for President Obama. But what is important here is that the general decline in Democratic share of the vote has had a reason that seems to be unbound to any one particular demographic. And so when we think about this, I think the important issue here is why? Why was the Democratic vote so weak in this election cycle as opposed to others? And that one is a really hard question to answer, but I do think there is something to be said for the negativity of the campaign. Throughout this entire campaign, the Democratic Party has been relying mostly on this idea that by attacking Donald Trump, they can increase support for the Democratic Party. And what it's come out and done for them is actually driven people away from the Democratic Party, along with uh, Donald Trump's use of things like Crooked Hillary and attacking President or Secretary Clinton on her uh, connections to Wall Street and her connections to rigging elections in the Democratic Party, and that this has been a salient feature of the campaign season, whereas the constant cries of racism and sexism and such against Donald Trump has been kind of a general trend among Democratic candidates, accusing the Republican candidate of such things. And so it kind of just doesn't stick out in the mind of the voting populace. Rather, they've heard that so many times that it's not unique, it's not special, and it's not driving their vote for the Democratic Party. Whereas the accusations coming from the Donald Trump campaign against Secretary Clinton were more unique and more able to be pointed to by the voting populace. As such, I think the vote was really hinged on that campaign. That the campaign that was able to find the unique feature of corruption, of populist sentiment, was able to further push third-party support. So I think this, on whole, should come as a moment of insight for the Democratic Party going forward, that they need to find a way to address their opposition on a ground that doesn't require lobbying racism and sexism, because it's not able to draw in supporters as well as they would hope. With that said, I hope that this has been informative, and I hope that going forward, we're able to make better decisions about how we approach the election campaigns for the President of the United States. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, if you think it was informative, please like, subscribe, and comment down below.